Okay, what if the country where the atrocity occurred is unwilling to prosecute its own criminals?
I would argue that first, an international court is retroactive. So this is happening after the fact, after a genocide has been committed. So there's no reason why, just because a government might be resistant, it doesn't mean that the people within that government wouldn't be. So that would be a false comparison.
What if the people were unwilling to prosecute their leader that committed crimes against humanity? Then what should we do?
Then we should at least try to establish some social norm within that nation. Like, we should
How do we
try to
do
make
that exactly?
education, for example, laying the sordid details, as I explained in my alternative.
Okay. Your second point is that prosecution will be arbitrary, correct?
Yes.
And you say that prosecutors will arbitrarily target the highest offenders, correct?
Not necessarily just the highest offenders. I mean, I would argue that that's implicit in the international court, but if you didn't buy that, we're still drawing lines between who's blameworthy and who's blameless in problems that are uniquely systemic, right?
Okay. Does this apply to national courts as well?
No, because those happen on much smaller scales. When I murder somebody, that doesn't mean that you have to target certain parts of my nervous
question.
system.
If there's a crime against humanity and the domestic court deals with it, then how does it avoid this problem?
Because rather than focusing on an external body making the decisions of who's blameworthy and who's blameless, we would rely on the populace in making its own decisions, its own popular decisions, in what would be actually accepted by society.
Do the people always act non-arbitrarily?
No, not necessarily.
Okay. At the very end of your case, you give an example that the ICTY was counterproductive, correct?
Yes.
Was this war that followed the tribunal necessarily a result of the tribunal?
I would argue that it was.
Do you have proof of causation?
No.
Okay. What exactly was your response to my second contention?
The second contention is that we're still not targeting the root problems that caused terrorism in the first place. Like, if I want to clarify, can I clarify that now?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So when terrorism occurs, it often happens because of Western intervention, for example, that we went there and it made people angry, and there's political aspects to it, not just religious ones. So just assuming that prosecuting terrorists will cause them to be deterred isn't sufficient. Rather, it's shown to be actually antithetical to that deterrence, because as we've seen today, the United States is stuck in quagmires throughout the world because of our intervention.
All right.
I'm Eric Wellman with 90.3 WCPN, and we've got a quick break in the action. So I'm joined by John Mercer, who's a debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you, Eric?
I was asking you just before the last break what the judges are thinking about and considering as they watch this.
We have three very qualified judges today. Mr. Peoples, Mr. Snook, and Mr. Braverman are accomplished debate judges in their own rights, and in the case of Peoples and Snook, debate coaches. And in addition to looking at the debaters' presentations, what points they're arguing, the cases that they've constructed, they're also looking at how well they handle themselves under cross-examination and how well they're willing to clash with their opponents. A big part of Lincoln-Douglas debate is the willingness to really take your opponent to task in an appropriate way.
Are the judges really purely listening to their words, or are they also looking at how they're physically presenting themselves?
That's really up to the judge. There is no rule that says presentation trumps words or words trump presentation. It's a judge's choice issue. The best debaters will do a little bit of both.
One of the things I find remarkable is their ability to not only think about what their own arguments are, but also listen to what the opponent's saying. How do they train to do that?
Well, you'll notice off camera, and the debater that is not speaking is taking copious notes.
Sure.
It's called flowing. They practice it all the time so that they not only know their case, but by the end of the debate they know their opponent's case well enough to hopefully tear it apart.
Do the debaters, you had mentioned earlier that they spend hours preparing for
Correct.
any particular debate. Do they get help in preparation?
Sure. Debate teams are coached by really some spectacular individuals around the city of Cleveland and throughout Ohio. The Ohio High School Speech League is very active and promotes coaches and the work that they do. But debaters also have access to a lot of online resources, as well as there are camps in the summer that kids can attend, and they work together. One of the great things about speech and debate is the cooperation that occurs. These two young men right now are debating very furiously against one another, but once it's over with, they're friends. One of the wonderful things about speech and debate is that opponents are comrades. all of the time except during those 40 minutes that they're debating.
I should reiterate that we are at the City Club of Cleveland, and the topic of this debate is resolved. The United States ought to submit to the jurisdiction of an international court designed to prosecute crimes against humanity. And they're still writing furiously. What happens next? What are we expecting?
Well, next we go into the rebuttal phase, and I see we're getting very close to that part of the phase beginning. Each of the debaters does get 4 minutes of preparation time, and they can use those 4 minutes whenever they want, and we're just about now ready to start the rebuttal phase of the debate.
Start with my opponent's value of morality. I agree that we're talking about moral obligations, but our government has a strong moral obligation to its own people. His value criterion is the protection of human rights. This assumes that we have an equal obligation to protect the rights of everybody. I would argue, since Americans are the ones that are paying taxes to the American government and obeying our law, the government has a special reciprocal obligations to Americans. In other words, we don't have the same obligation to protect the rights of North Koreans as we do to protect Americans. For example, dumping trillions of dollars in foreign aid to African countries might be the moral thing to do. It might end up protecting human rights, but it's too big of a burden to place on the American people. Our government has special obligations towards us. My opponent's observation is that I have to show the court to be effective, but even if the court is ineffective, we should still join in the name of national security. His first argument for why the court is ineffective is that we have to look at native social norms instead. We have to deal with the conflict internally in the nation itself. I agree, but in the case that the country is unwilling or incapable of prosecuting its own criminals, that's when we need an external actor. In Rwanda, the government was so weak that it simply could not prosecute its own criminals, and in Yugoslavia, the government was just unwilling. My opponent will come up here and provide the alternative that we need to educate the people and provide social norms. I think we need a more realistic, decisive action. We can't just convince the people that they've been wrong the whole time. His second point is that prosecution will be arbitrary and that the highest offenders will be targeted. First of all, if the court has limited resources, who is it going to target? It's going to target the highest offenders. It has to choose and it has to make priorities. But second of all, a national court will be just as arbitrary, if not more so. If the people control the court, they're the victims of the crime against humanity, so obviously they're going to be biased against their own victimizers. And finally, at the end, he gives you this example from the New York Times about how after the ICTY, there was war. Correlation is not causation. I asked my opponent in cross-ex if he had any evidence that this war was actually a result of the criminal tribunal, and he had no evidence. Now look to my case. At the very top, he says that ought must deal specifically with moral obligations. That's perfectly fine. As I've stated, our government has a special moral obligations to its own citizens. And again, in response to my criterion, he says that we have to look to the intrinsic worth of all human beings because everybody is equal. Those rights might be equal, but since Americans are the one paying taxes to their government, our government has a specific, special, exceptional obligation to its own people. Now look to his responses to my first contention. First, he says that we don't have to act unilaterally despite not joining the court. We can have official investigations and reports. The problem is those reports will occur without the consent of the other countries. If we don't join the ICC, then the crimes will occur in the jurisdiction of the ICC itself, so the member nations won't be willing to cooperate with us with those investigations. In response to my second point, he says we can still act morally by joining the UN, but the UN is not a court. It doesn't prosecute criminals. He says that we can promote morality in other ways, but I'm talking about perceptions, not realities. We're going to be perceived as immoral and perceived as having a diminished moral high ground, whether or not that's actually the case. Finally, in response to my third point, he says that we have to make it clear that we're not acting hypocritically. Despite our best efforts to make it clear, due to all of the anti-Americanism in the world, we probably won't be successful in getting that message across. So the best way to reduce that hatred and the best way to promote our image and our prestige in the world and to maintain our leadership is in fact to join this court that 120 nations have supported and that only 2 democracies, including the United States, have opposed. Finally, he doesn't really respond to my second contention. He just gives you this argument that we have to focus on deterrence, but prosecuting terrorists is not mutually exclusive with deterrence that will end up causing fear and have a deterrent effect. He talks about the Iraq War and how that's actually made terrorism worse. I agree, that was an act of unilateralism. But moreover, I don't have to support the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan because that doesn't have anything to do with the court at all. So in sum, the reason you affirm is that foreign policy must be based on national security. I've given you reasons why not joining the court will undermine our relationships with our allies and why the court is essential in the prosecution of terrorists due to evidence sharing and extradition.